Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are back and we are going to be taking a look at the Freestyle Chess Grand Slam Tour finale being held in South Africa. Now, the series of tournaments started all the way back in February. There were 3 big events, one in Germany, one in Paris, and one in Las Vegas, but ultimately it culminates with this grand final. Now, the series has seen many ups and downs. There have been changes in formats, players, everything else. We don't really need to get into that, but going to this final, there are 8 players and they're competing for a grand prize of $200,000. Now, the format is pretty straightforward. You have 8 players. The top 4 will advance to the next stage where they will compete for the grand prize and play for places 1st through 4th. If you finish in the bottom 4, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, you'll be playing for slightly less prizes, but still some points to boot. So we're going to pick it up with the 4th round. They're playing 7 games today, and this matchup of course features the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen against the future first American world champion Hans Niemann. Now, Magnus got off to a very shaky start in this event. In the first round of the qualification stage, he lost to Sindarov, who we'll be talking about a little bit later on. He would go on a rampage, winning the next 2 games to have a score of 2 out of 3. Now, Hans, on the other hand, got off to a very rough start. He had a draw in the first game and then lost 2 games in a row, so he's languishing at the bottom of the standings as they head up into this critical matchup. So Magnus has the white pieces. As this is being played with Fisher Random Chess or Chess 960, you will notice the assortment of pieces on the back rank is completely random. So Magnus has the white pieces. He opens with the move C4. One last point I want to add, of course, since we're doing the recaps on the fly, is that the results are not yet finalized, but also the time control for his qualification stage is played with 10 minutes per player. So we get C4. Now we get the move C5 from Hans, and Magnus plays the move B4. Here we get the move D6 being played, and now Magnus plays the move B5. Now, one of the things when you play Fisher Random Chess is you look at a couple of things. I've mentioned this in many of my other recaps. You look at the center. Can you play for the center like you would in normal standard chess? The next thing is that what you look for is symmetry. Can you play a mirror on the wall setup? And after the move C4 here, black actually doesn't really have great choices. If you don't play the mirror and you play something like E5, for example, after this wild move F4, let's say you were to take on F4 at something like G3, takes, white is down a pawn here, but apparently white is already completely winning with these great bishops. Now, of course, this idea is very, very unusual. I'm not sure any players would find this in an actual game if they didn't have a lot of time, but it does show just how different the positions and the game are versus regular chess, because you will never see a bishop pair on these diagonals like this in a normal game that we would play in a top level tournament. So we get C4, C5, B4. Now we get the move D6 from Hans. Magnus plays B5 here. He does not trade the pawns here. He perhaps was a little bit worried about takes and some idea like bishop A4 to check the king on this long diagonal. So we get B5. Now we get G6, D3, B6, and Magnus plays move G3. Now this position is relatively dry so far, but white does have a slight advantage here, primarily because this dark square bishop that white has a lot more scope here, whereas this bishop on E8 is kind of hemmed in by the pawns. There's really no scope. Even if you push here, bishop can't really access the diagonal. So this bishop on E1 is simply a better bishop due to the space than this light square bishop that black has. So we get the move G3. Hans plays knight c7, bishop c3, we get trade, and now we get the move knight d7. Now what's happened here is you probably just heard me say, well, white has a better bishop than black has. That is correct. However, when we look at this position, I did not talk about these 2 bishops specifically because both these bishops have great scope. So when Magnus goes for this trade, now what he's arguing is that his light square bishop has great scope on this diagonal, and Hans is left with this crummy bishop on e8. So we get the move knight d7. Magnus plays a4, we get knight f6, and now we get the move knight to e3 being played. Hans plays bishop d7, Magnus castles, Hans castles, and now we get the move knight b3. Now at this point, white has a tiny advantage. White probably wants to play a5 to attack on the queen side. Black also is kind of restricted here from the standpoint that you can't really play in the center. You can't go d5 because white guards with the knight and the bishop. You can try to play e6 here and play for d5. You can also maybe go e5, although that creates this big weakness on d5 for the horse. So it's just very tricky to play. Additionally, as this is a game being played with limited time on the clock, finding plans is very tricky, and using your time correctly is probably one of the biggest tools or biggest advantages that you can have. So we get the move a5 from Hans. Magnus now plays move d4, and you'll notice that Hans has now closed any idea of Magnus attacking on the queen side. Say, just to illustrate the point, if you're able to get something like this with rook a1, pieces are coming to the queen side very quickly, and white has a big advantage. So Hans tries to close the door on the queen side by playing the move a5. But now Magnus is able to play d4, and with these knights aiming towards the center squares here, white is actually doing very well. So we get knight to e6. Magnus plays d5, Hans plays knight d4, and now we get the move queen to b2. Of course, white does not trade the ponies, because after pawn takes knight, whoopsie daisy, the rook and the knight are both being attacked or forked by the pawn on d4. So we get queen b2 here, Magnus guards the pawn, and now we get the move e5, and here we get the glitch move, pawn takes pawn. Now this is of course what is known as en peasant or en passant for any French speakers out there. It's the glitch move where when a pawn moves two squares forward from the original square, you're able to capture it diagonally like this. So we get the trade. Magnus plays rook e1, we get the move king g7, and now we get the move rook d3. Now the problem here for Hans is that this structure of the on the board is very similar to a King's Indian. I'm not going to try to set up a normal position in this case, because it's going to be too hard since this is set up with the random position to begin with. But this is very similar to a King's Indian or a Benoni, where black goes c5 and then e6, and there's a trade of pawns. For anybody who's not advanced, just look up the Benoni or King's Indian to understand what I'm referring to in this video. Nonetheless, even though you have the Benoni or King's Indian structure, you'll notice here that Hans is missing the dark squared bishop. He doesn't have the fianchetto bishop on the diagonal like you normally do in the King's Indian, so his position is significantly worse. So you get e5. Magnus plays knight d2, now we get bishop e6, and here we get the move knight d5. Now Magnus is showing great understanding, because what he wants to do here is he wants to kick this horse out of town. Now one thing that I've spoken about a lot is something called the bastion, and this is of course a knight which is outposted here on d4, where this knight cannot be removed. You'll notice these two pawns, you'd love to put the pawn back to attack the knight, or this one back to attack the knight, but you simply can't move a pawn backwards to dislodge this horse. But in the game, as you'll notice here, this is not actually a bastion, because the knight on d4 can be removed. Because the pawn is on e2 versus e4, white can play e3 to kick this knight out of town, and the knight will have to go back to f5. So here we get knight takes, we get the move bishop g4, and now Magnus plays f3. Hans goes bishop h3, and Magnus plays the move e3 to kick the knight. Here we get the move knight to f5, and now we get this move knight to e4. Now at this point, the game has gone horribly astray for Hans for a couple of reasons. The first one, which probably isn't obvious, is that this bishop on h3 here is actually in serious danger of being trapped. Say you play a move like queen c7 after knight to f2, suddenly this bishop has no retreat, the knight's in the way, you can't get the bishop back, so you'll lose the bishop and the game. Secondarily, there's the obvious weakness on the diagonal, where white can really pressure these pawns here and create weaknesses. When you combine that with the fact that black has all these passive pieces, these pawns aren't really going anywhere, the position is already completely lost according to the computer. So we get the move knight to h6 here. Hans wants to create space for the bishop to retreat, and now Magnus plays move g4. Now, unfortunately for Hans here, the computer says that after c4, rook c3, knight e7 would have been the best way to go. And if white tries g4 here, there'd be knight takes d5, winning the pawn. So Hans desperately had to push his pawn first and then go knight e7, attacking the pawn to free up the scope for the bishop to go backwards. Nonetheless, after knight f2, attacking the bishop, bishop d7, and e4 here, white is still substantially better. You have rook c1 to hit the pawn on c4. You still have the f4 ideas opening up the center, and it's just very hard to defend. But we get knight h6 instead. Magnus plays g4, and now you'll notice that black's bishop is in fact getting trapped by knight to f2 here, so Hans is going to have to sacrifice some material. We got knight takes pawn, pawn takes, bishop takes, and Magnus plays the move rook d2 here. Very logical move, because white is up an extra pony here on e4, and the only way for black to attack is to do something on this open f-file, and Magnus just wants to put the rooks on the f-file, trade the rooks, and win the game. It's very, very simple and very straightforward. So in this position, after the move rook to d2, we now get the move rook to f5, and here Magnus plays the move rook to f2. We get queen to c7, Magnus plays rook f1, we get queen e7, and now we get to move bishop to g2. Hans plays rook takes rook, we get queen takes, we get to move bishop to f5, and now Magnus very calmly and coolly plays the move queen g3. We get rook to f8 being played. Were Hans to trade the bishop for the knight, one of the really nifty things here about this position is you'll see this pawn running forward, but the pawn is simply blockaded by the bishop. It cannot go forward here. Of course, you can't capture anything, can't go forward. So even though this pawn is going up the board, the bishop stops the pawn from going anywhere, and white is simply free to start attacking on the king side towards the king on g7. That's why Hans plays rook f8. We get to move knight c3. e4 is played, and here Magnus goes h4. Now we get to move h5. Magnus plays king h2. We get to move rook to f6. And here we have to move bishop takes e4. Now, this isn't the only way to win. There are probably many ways to win. Rook to f4 would be working. Queen to f4 would be working. But Magnus correctly sees the tactic that he's able to take this pawn on e4. And now we get to move bishop takes. And after rook takes f6, Hans Niemann resigns the game here because worried to capture with the king. There's queen to g5, checking the king. King goes back. You trade. You take. And after c4, king g3, the knight stops the pawn. If the pawn ever goes forward, you capture. And otherwise, it's very simple. You just bring your king up the board here. King f7, you can take with a check. Even knight c3 would be good enough. Bottom line, white has an extra knight. The pawns are going to push forward, and white will win the game. So that is why after this move, rook takes f6, Hans resigns the game. This means that Magnus gets his third win in a row, and he now moves to 3 out of 4 and puts himself in prime contention to be in the top half of the bracket and playing for the grand prize in the tournament. So he gets the win. So now we're going to move to the 6th round in the event. And what I'm trying to do with this recap is go around the horn a little bit, talk about some different players. One thing that I did not do much of recently is, some people might be wondering, I did not do many recaps on the FIDE World Cup. In fact, I'm not sure if I did any. And in the FIDE World Cup, it was a very, very big tournament. It was played in Goa, India. The top 3 players qualified for the FIDE Canada's tournament in March, which will be held in Cyprus, an event that I also will be partaking in. Now, the reason I went through that whole dialogue and rambling, or yapping as the kids would say these days, is that there was one player who really stood out in the event. And that, of course, was the overall winner, Yavokir Sindarov from Uzbekistan. Now, people who've watched my channel, you're no stranger to the fact that Yavokir Sindarov is a very, very strong player from Uzbekistan. He's somebody I lost to, actually, in the freestyle event in Germany at the beginning of the year. He has perhaps been overshadowed in recent times because there is another Uzbeki player who's garnered more attention. That player, of course, being Norbek Abdusatorov, who has been, I think, in the top 5, if I'm not mistaken, within the last year, but has had a rough go of it recently. So a lot of people have noticed Norbek, but they haven't been talking about Sindarov. But one thing I've said on my streams, and I may have even said it in a recap or two, is I've actually believed for a while now that Sindarov will eventually turn out to be a better classical chess player than Norbek Abdusatorov. Maybe I'll be proven completely wrong and I'll look like an idiot in 5 or 10 years, but I do think that Sindarov is a very, very strong player, very underrated, simply because he's been overshadowed. So Sindarov, I've spoken about him. He, of course, here is playing against Hans Niemann once again. Hans having a very rough day going into this game with simply 1 point out of 5. 2 draws thus far against Levon and Arjun, if I'm not mistaken. Sindarov, on the other hand, is running red hot. Sindarov started off the day with a huge win over Magnus Carlsen. He also beat Fabiano Caruana. He's leading the qualification stage with 4 points out of 5. He's obviously going to be playing for first through 4th place, regardless of what happens in this game, but really, really doing well. So for Hans, he needs to win this game to get back into the hunt. Otherwise, it's going to be another forgettable event for him. So let's jump right into the action. So Sindarov has the white pieces, and he opens with the move e4. We get to move e5, and now we have the move c3 being played. Now, again, as I mentioned in the first game that we covered so far, the first 2 things you look for: center control and mirror on the wall. Now, in this case, Hans could perhaps try to play c5 and play the classic Siciliano. I suspect the reason Hans did not play this is he probably was very worried about c3 and d4 to build the big white center. One thing you'll notice that's different from regular chess, if black plays the move knight f6 here, which is a very standard line against the Alpine Sicilian, white can just go d4. Because if you try to take the pawn, you lose your knight and you lose the game immediately. So when you look at this on first glance and you see c3, it's very easy to be concerned. Now, in a couple of the other games, I think there were some games featuring like Fabiano and Vincent and Magnus and Levon. I believe this did occur where after c3, d5 was played, and after takes, knight b6 occurred, and there were some very interesting and rich battles played between other contenders in the event. But Hans decides to play the move e5 instead. It's simply a gut feel what you want to do here. We get c3, and now we get the move d5. Now, this is a very, very bold stroke from Hans, sacrificing a pawn this way. As you can tell from the evaluation bar, the computer simply hates this move. So after d5, we get the move pawn takes pawn. Now we get the move knight to b6, and here we get the move knight to f3. Now the big issue for black here is that you cannot push this pawn forward. In a lot of king pawn openings where there's e4, e5, there are many situations where you're able to push a pawn, sacrifice, and attack a knight right away. But because the players are playing Fischer random here, when you see this move knight to f3, the pawn on e5 is simply under attack, and you're unable to play the move e4 because of queen takes e4. So we get the move c6 from Hans. Sindarov takes, we get knight to f6, and now we get to move d4. Now Hans here knows that he's made a big mistake. It's very clear. So he decides to throw all caution to the wind. He's just hoping against hope to create something complex. But as you can tell from the evaluation bar, computer's having no part of it. We're only 6 moves into the game, and Hans already can effectively resign. So we get pawn takes pawn. Sindarov takes, and now we get to move rook to e8. One thing that was very natural in the previous game that we didn't have to really talk about was castling kingside or queenside. So after rook to e8, what Hans is trying to do here is he wants to simply castle his king out of the center of the board. You cannot currently castle. It is possible when you have a king and rook already castled like this to consider ideas like h5 and something like a rook to h6 to bring the rook out. But in this case, it doesn't really make sense because, as you'll notice, even if you get this bishop, if you go here, the bishops are perfectly placed. Simply capture the rook no matter how you try to activate it. So if the rook unable to be activated, rook to e8 is very logical so that you can castle this way. Now we get to move bishop to f3. Hans castles, and we get to move rook to d1. Now after rook to d1, as you can tell, Sindarov simply wants to castle. The fact that Sindarov has all these extra pawns, 2 extra pawns in the center, black's pieces are still on the back rank, and white's bishops, knights, everything's coming into the action. Unless Sindarov does something completely insane, he is going to win. So here we get to move bishop to c7. After bishop to c7, we get this move h3, and now Hans plays knight c4. Now, if Sindarov were to castle, you would hang the pawn. You don't want to do that. So we get h3, knight c4. Now we get to move bishop to g5, pressuring the knight on f6. What's amazing about this game, or I would say what's amazing about looking at chess games with computers, is that even though this move looks very natural and very human, this move is actually a mistake. Computer, as you can tell, the evaluation has gone down. It just shows how rich chess is or how strong computers are, that even when you see a position like this where it's something like +2, humans will make mistakes. Top level humans will make mistakes, and computers will punish humans even in positions that appear to be completely winning like this. So we got pawn takes pawn. Sindarov trades, he ruins Hans's pawn structure, but at the same time, now Hans with this knight on c4 is pressuring the pawn, and black also has the 2 Bs. So we get the move bishop takes pawn. Hans plays knight takes pawn, we get bishop takes rook, and now we get the move knight takes rook. Now, as you can tell, the evaluation has gone very, very sideways here. And the primary reason the evaluation has gone sideways is that Sindarov has committed a cardinal sin. He has forgotten to castle his king out of the center of the board. So we get the move queen takes d1, we get rook takes e8, we get the move castles, and now we get the move queen to b2. Now, the reason computer says that black is fine here is that white has a lot of problems. You have these weak pawns on a2 and c3. You have this knight in the corner. Black has the 2 bishops. Bishops can become extremely active. And you have a rook on the open file. So things are finally starting to look up for Hans. But Sindarov is going to make no mistakes, as we're about to see. Now, here I think the best move is apparently queen b6. And I think the reason is that you're supposed to go queen d6, creating a double A battery with a checkmate threat. In a game of blitz, very, very hard to find. If the players had 20-30 minutes, I think queen b6 d6 should be found. But in a game of blitz where time is getting low, that's just not super realistic. So we got queen a4 here, hitting the rook and hitting the pawn at the same time. And now we get to move rook to e7. Sindarov plays move queen to c4, and after queen c4, we get to move queen b6. Now, this does speak to what I said about how Hans realizes that there are no longer any threats here. The queen guards both pawns. The queen is also spying the 2 bishops at the same time. And Hans correctly plays queen b6, both because you have bishop to a6 to hit the queen and the rook, and also to play queen d6 with the double A battery. So now we get to move queen to b4. And here Hans plays the move rook to e5. Now the computer actually would have preferred Hans to trade the queens and play bishop b6, and the reason for this is that after knight b3 and rook c7, suddenly the bishop on b6 is really well placed to spy this diagonal. Black can play rook c4, hitting the knight and the pawn, and already here I think if anybody's to be careful, it's probably white in fact. But Hans misses his opportunity. Instead he plays the move rook to e5. Now we get to move knight to b3, and here we get to move queen a6. Now again, I think queen takes b4 might have been playable, but the point is that after queen to a6, we get to move knight to f3, rook e8, and now we get to move a4. As I was starting to say before I lost my train of thought, the big issue for Hans is that this bishop, even though it's a good bishop, if it ever goes to b6 here, white can always just close the diagonal with knight d4 here, and the bishop is simply not doing a lot because the knight is anchored by this pawn and by this knight on f3. So we get queen to e6. Sindarov plays knight d4, we get queen to d7, and now we get to move queen to b5. Hans plays a6, we get queen c5, and we get to move bishop b7. Sindarov plays a5, we get king to h8, and now we get to move rook to b1. Now I went through the last couple of moves very quickly because not a whole lot happened, but what you will have noticed here, and this is one of the biggest strengths of Hans Niemann, is that he is way up on the clock in this game. Because Sindarov is down to seconds on the clock, Hans is moving very fast and errors are starting to occur. And this is also one of the big arguments for why a lot of people think that classical chess is too slow and we should move towards more rapid and blitz formats, because mistakes happen when players get low on time, and when mistakes happen you get more decisive games. Decisive games generally are better for the fans. So we get to move bishop to a8. Now Sindarov plays queen h5, we get bishop to e4, rook to e1, and here we get to move bishop g6. Here Sindarov trades, and now he plays move queen c5, and we get to move queen to b8. Now this is actually a big miss from Hans here. I'm a little bit surprised he missed it. Had he played the move queen to d8 here, simply guarding the bishop but also hitting the pawn on a5, he would have been doing very well. Now on top of guarding the bishop and hitting the pawn, the queen also guards this pawn on f6, which is very important, because after this move queen to b8 here, white goes g3, but let's say white were to play, I guess white can't play queen 6, but just to illustrate the point, if we were to ignore the fact there's a checkmate here, if black ever takes a pawn on a5, white can take this pawn on f6 with check. So if you go queen d8, you guard this pawn, you hit the pawn on a5, and after queen c6, bishop takes a5, takes with even number of pawns on the board, Hans should not lose this position. Alas, he goes queen b8, and this gives Sindarov time to play the move g3, stopping any back rank threats with the checkmate. I skipped over it because I was trying to prove another point, but after queen to b1 here, you'll notice the king can't run forward because of the bishop, and after knight e1, queen takes e1. It is the classic spaghetti-o time. The king gets back rank checkmated, and you lose the game. And that's also why this is so important, because after queen d8 g3 takes, for example, say you play knight c6, there would have been a bishop to b6 move hitting the queen, and black is in the game. But when you go queen b8 g3, now you're still not attacking the pawn, and white is able to create the space for the king, and both the pawns on a6 and f6 become very weak. So we get the move bishop takes g3. Here we get to move queen to b6, and now Hans plays move bishop d6. Now G3 is actually a good move here. After bishop takes g3, computer says white should play the cold-blooded move queen to c6 here, hitting the pawns on f6 and a6, but with 9 seconds on the clock, is very understandable when Sindarov plays queen b6. But now we get the move bishop d6, and this is just a terrible decision from Hans that he plays very quickly here. If Hans had played the move queen to d6, for example, or even king to g7, guarding this pawn from being captured, he would have had no chances to lose the game. Primary reason being that if white were to take the bishop, which I didn't point out yet, after queen takes pawn, if you go king f1, there's bishop d3, checking the king, you got to block, and then I take, you block, I take the knight, you cannot take because that would put your king in check, you go, I trade, now I've got an extra bishop and I win the game. Additionally, after queen g3, if you go king h1, black can simply take and make a draw by repetition. If you play knight h2 here, there's bishop e4 check, and then it's queen g2, checkmating the king on g1. But Hans instead plays bishop d6, and now we get to move queen takes a6, and even though the white king looks a little bit weak on this open g file here, with this passed pawn on a5 that's rushing up the board combined with the weak black king side here, white is winning. So we get bishop to e4. Now we get to move queen b6. Hans plays queen g8. This is a mistake here. If he were to trade the queens and go bishop c5, he simply wins this pawn on b6, and with it, he will not lose. One other important point I want to make that I mentioned at the start before recapping this game is that Hans is doing very badly in this event. And for him, he's probably thinking with the mindset that he needs to win this game to have any chance of finishing in the top 4. And so from that standpoint, he probably figures, I can't make the draw. So he goes queen g8. We get king to f1, he checks, we get king to e1, and now we get to move queen f8. And here, Sindarov simply pushes his p up the board with a6 and a7. Hans plays queen e7, we get king d2, bishop e4, and now we get to move a7. And while it looks like this king on d2 is very weak after, say, bishop f4 and king d1, these knights guard the king perfectly. The queen is on this open file. The pawn is 1 square away from queening. Combine that with the weak pawn and everything else here, white is simply winning. So here Hans plays king g7. This move loses on the spot. It's simply Hans overlooks a tactical shot. Sindarov is able to promote the pawn to a queen, and the reason this is a big mistake is now if black takes right away, there's knight to f5 forking the king and the queen. The white queens, here Hans checks, we get king d1, and now we get to move bishop takes a8. We get knight to f5 check, king f8, knight takes queen, Hans takes the knight, king e1, and now we get to move king e7. Now this position white is winning because black has 2 bishops in return for the queen, but when you combine the fact that white can push this pawn as well as the fact that these bishops are very, very loose, they're not guarded. For example, if you get a position like something like this where the bishops are anchored, the king anchors the bishop, pawn anchors the bishop, maybe there's a small chance of survival. With the bishops being so loose here on these 2 squares, there's no hope. So we get the move queen c5, king e6, queen c8, king e5, we got check, king f5 takes, and now we get the move h5, queen d7, king g5, and after the move h4, Hans resigns the game here. Because if you move the king back to g6, there's queen d3, checking the king, winning the bishop. If you take the pawn, there's queen to h4, and suddenly the bishop goes, you lose this one. If this one goes, you lose this one. There's no way to guard the 2 bishops here. And last but not least, if you play king h6, same thing. Queen to f5, you lose one of the bishops, and once you lose the bishop, there's just no hope of surviving. So that's why Hans resigns this game here. This means that Sindarov moves to a scorching 5 points out of 6. Sindarov would go on to finish first place overall after the 7th and final round concluded. Hans, on the other hand, very, very rough day. He finishes in 6th place, showing just how tough this event is. And even if he didn't do very well, there were plenty of players who suffered more than he did. So going into the knockout stage now, the top 4 seeds are set. First place is Sindarov. Second place is Levon Aronian. Third place, maybe a bit of a surprise, is Arjun Erigaisi. And fourth place is Magnus Carlsen. So those 4 players will compete for the grand prize of $200,000. Fabiano, who's done very well in freestyle overall, had a very rough day. He would finish in 5th place. Hans is 6th. 7th place was Vincent Keimer, who won the event in February. And last but not least, in 8th place was Parham Magsudaloo from Iran. Those 4 players, Fabi, Parham, Hans, and Vincent, will play for 5th through 8th place. Perhaps a bit of a bummer for all of them, especially Vincent and Fabi, who have done very well overall. But at the end of the day, in these sorts of events, anything can happen, as we see. So, exciting day of qualification at the freestyle event in South Africa. We'll see what happens in the coming days. I think Magnus is the favorite, but it will be exciting to cover and recap going forward. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the qualification day of the Freestyle Grand Slam Chess Tour being held in Cape Town, South Africa. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with more great recaps and content in the coming days. Hope you guys enjoyed it and have a great rest of your day. See you. Bye.